All right, good morning, everybody. Everybody's had coffee, so hopefully everybody's awake. So I want to talk to you about this morning this idea of KPIs, right? Key performance indicators about APIs. How are you going to measure APIs? And the subtitle, as you can see, is or why API calls might be the new web hits. And you might be measuring it all wrong. So what does that mean? So I want to go back to a slide that I used here at the same event 5 years ago at BAPI, New York, to talk about the evolution of and the parallels between the API world and the web world, right? To sort of look at where that was and where we were, in that case, back in 2009, right? Where you sort of didn't know why you needed a website. Of course, you need a website. And then the APIs a few years ago were, why the hell do I need that? And then, now it's like, okay, of course we have an API. What should we do with it? And I think the reality is you are here, right? We are way over on the right-hand side of this chart because we're now 2014. We've had APIs for a while. That's not new news, right? So how many of you remember hit counters, right? Yeah, I see some hands here. Anybody who's lived in the .com era remembers things that look like this, right? And that was, right, that was web metrics, right? In the old days, if you look at what happened with the evolution of measuring websites, right? This is where we started in 1995, right? It was, how many hits did you get? We got 1 billion hits on our website, right? That was like the big thing. We realized that that was a semi-bogus measure, right? And so we evolved, right? And then we realized, oh, okay, no, it's not that. It's page views. Page views are a bit more meaningful than a web hit. And then, of course, it's visitors more meaningful than page views. And now unique visitors and so on are very important. And then last but not least is conversions, right? So now we get to conversions, and conversions are kind of the end of the funnel for a website, right? So, but we're talking about APIs, right? This is the API conference. So what does that mean for the world of APIs, right? And so if you think about it, we know that API calls are good, decent, baseline metric for APIs. But they're kind of, to my mind, a bit of the web hits of APIs. We kind of you need to think about evolving past that, right? So that's the point of this conversation. The thing I want to talk about is filling in those question marks up here about, well, what else am I going to be measuring? So, and I think it's really important to think about the great APIs, right? Not just okay APIs or sucky APIs. You get measured, right? You think about, what am I measuring? Why am I measuring it? And then the question is, of course, well, John, what am I supposed to measure? Having run ProgrammableWeb for 10 years and been in this business for a long time, one of the most common questions was, what business model should we have, and what should we be measuring? What's the definition of success? So I think the answer is, like so many things in life, is, well, it depends. It's not that satisfying. But I think the first criteria to think about what you should be measuring with your API is why. Why do you have an API? Why, right? And there's a lot of good reasons. I mean, folks in this room who have APIs, on this chart, you'll see here, I don't know, 15, 17 different reasons or strategies as to why I have an API. And you need to think about, okay, which of these? And there should be, for almost anybody in here, you should have more than one from this list, right? And these are why you're doing it. And you think about that, okay, so that's going to help me determine what my KPIs, what my metrics should be, right? And I think the second most important question about KPIs for APIs is who? Who is your API for? Because if you can't answer this question, you're screwed, right? Because you have to think about where in this continuum. I think at this point, if you look at this is, I think, the standard these days, what we see as an industry, the continuum of APIs is sort of who it's for, right? Who's your audience? You have your partners and customers, and then you have everybody else, right? The long tail, the external developer, those public API programs, right? Internal, private, open. Terminology varies a little bit, but I think as an industry, we've settled pretty much on this vocabulary, right? But this really is super important in what you're measuring, right? Really super important. Because I think the answers to these two questions, right, the who and the why, should drive what you measure, right? If they're not connected, you're doing it wrong. So There are a lot of ways to think about how to measure your APIs. There are a lot of ways. So here's a smattering, right? Here's a grouped sample of ways that you might be measuring your APIs. And again, somewhat to answer those two questions, right? So you can measure traffic, right? You can measure developer traffic, of course, there it is, the very first one, total API calls, right? That's our web hits metric of today, right? Developers, right? That's the next piece of the food chain, measuring their developers. Service, how well am I doing? Is it getting delivered on time? Marketing, right? What's my developer funnel look like? And we'll talk about that some more. We'll talk about a bunch of these more later. Support and business, right? So I just want to give you a sample. And so here's a whole bunch. Oh, that's a lot. Okay. So there's more. So here's a whole other set of metrics that you could be thinking about, right? Customer satisfaction. What's my net promoter score for my API? Some folks measure that. Or my churn. Is my churn going up? Is my churn going down for my developers and my platform? Community, quality, right? Two other aspects to measuring your API program. Is it winning? Is it losing? And we sort of get maturity, innovation, right? If you want to think about, why do I have this? Is it for innovation? Well, how am I going to measure innovation? Is that like new apps? Is that developers? Is it, what's the metric I want for that? Maturity, I think we learned over time, building better APIs, what that looks like. And last but not least in this particular group is channel, right? Where does my API traffic go through? Is it all for mobile apps? Is it all for internal? Is it for web? Those sorts of channel questions I think are really super important. So there are a lot of things you can measure, right? That was a sampling. That's a lot. And I think that you have to be careful to not do that. I'll throw a lot at you in the next 15, 20 minutes of different metrics you can measure. But the reality is for any of you, right, you have to think about, well, what matters to me, right? Why am I doing this? Who am I doing it for? I'm not going to drown in KPIs, meaningless numbers. We're just talking about some of the, the sort of Internet of Things volume of data. Well, there's a ton of stuff in there you don't want to measure per se. So I think, and I'll give you about half a dozen secrets that I think about good API metrics, good API KPIs and what we've seen. And we've talked to hundreds of API providers about what they do with this. But they prioritize what to measure, right? You have to think about that whole list. I just showed you 40 of them, and there's another 100. But what's really important, right? Because that's where you have to focus. And I think a really good way to do that is to pick a perspective. It doesn't have to be just one, but thinking about what lens am I going to use, right? What role, what hat am I wearing when I measure my APIs? So here are like 8 different ways to do it, right? So you can have your CFO lens, right? I'm looking at finance. I'm looking at marketing, CEO, operations, right? Those sorts of metrics. And I'll dig into a couple of these. QA, revenue officer, right? Project management, product management, or PR, right? All these matter. And you can have a set of metrics for your API that front any of these, right? Often people will build dashboards around these and find the spreadsheet, find the thing that matters to you about any one of these. So to give you a couple of examples, here's the CFO lens, right? What am I going to look at if I'm the CFO looking at an API program? Well, okay, it might be total direct and indirect revenue, right? This is a relatively important metric, but not important for all APIs. So I'll show you examples later of APIs for which this isn't really the thing. This isn't the thing you should be measuring. It's not your core KPI. Margin, return on investment, right? Those sorts of things. Capital expenditure, operational expenditure, those sorts of things. And then the lifetime value of a customer, right? In this case, often your customer is a developer. It could be the user of the developer's app, but often it's developers, right? So what's the lifetime value? Because you're going to probably spend, if you have a public API program, you're going to spend money to get them. What do I get out of it? So those are sort of if you're taking the CFO lens. The next one I'll show you in a little more detail is the ops lens, right? These are the operational KPIs for your API that you need to think about, right? There's more. So performance, availability, errors, right? Any of those matter. Faults, defect backlog, and often I think people make a mistake of not looking at these as trends. There's a huge difference between looking at this as a point in time, what was my traffic yesterday, right? How many errors did I have? How many errors did I have this week? That doesn't mean nearly as much as if you look at that over some sustained period of time, right? Those ratios and those trends are hugely important, hugely important. And the third and last one I'll dive into slightly more here is the marketing role, right? So most APIs need some flavor of marketing, right? Certainly for the public ones. And what is that developer acquisition cost, right? How much money am I spending to get somebody onto my platform? And when we were running ProgrammableWeb years ago, that's how we made a lot of our money, was selling advertising to API providers and tool providers, because they were trying to figure out, it was so hard to get developers to come into their platform, right? So they're willing to spend a fair amount of money because the dollar per cost of acquisition per developer was pretty high, because they're not easy to get, right? So how do you, what's the secret sauce? So anyway, that acquisition cost is hugely important. The next piece is demographics, right? So once you have a developer or the ones that you want, what does that look like, right? And this is akin to somewhat, again, going back to the old web metrics, the .com era metrics that we use for our websites. Of course you care about the demographics, so why don't you care about the demographics for your API program, right? Again, you may be only care about the enterprise developer and not the sort of long tail developer. So how does that map to the who? And portal visitor count, SEO, SEM, those sorts of things matter. And then last but not least, I think in this list that's super notable, again with a public API program, is I don't know how many hackathons I see going on this year, but literally hundreds, if not thousands of hackathons going on, right? And of course, a huge portion of why those exist is to get developers interested in your platform, right? Who's sponsoring those? It's usually API providers who want developers to be hands-on with their API and get that feedback. And a common question about hackathons is, what should I be measuring? How do I know if that was successful? I spent money, I sent people there, I had a booth. So those sorts of metrics from a CMO perspective and an evangelism perspective are super important. So to pick up on that, the second KPI secret is knowing your developer funnel, right? So if we go back, and it's for public APIs more than others, if we go back to that same analogy, right? Websites. What do you measure on your website? Almost all websites that have some target have some funnel that goes through, right? You have, and this particular model, there's obviously dozens of these models. This one's come from Dave McClure's startup metrics for Pirates, so these 5 names. National Investor, by the way. So acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral, right? That was that set of models, right? As you go through that pipeline, from somebody hearing about your product or service, and whether they heard about it on Facebook or they Googled on it, they come through that funnel. Do they have a good first-time experience? Do they return? Do they make money? And then lastly, do they tell their friends, right? So that's a classic web funnel. So what does that look like for the API world? Good question. It looks almost the same, but it's different. So those of you who are really paying attention, you would have noticed like the sources aren't quite the same. So I substituted Hacker News for Facebook. But whatever it is, you're probably going to have different top-end sources for your funnel, right? They're not going to be the same, but remarkably the same. Activation. So we'll talk about this some more in a minute, but when a developer arrives at your site, do they have a good first-time experience when they land on your developer portal? Or is that a sucky experience and they don't succeed and they leave, right? You don't want that to happen. Developers return, right? So at that point, have they gotten their API key, right? Did they go through that whole process and are a registered developer? Are they actually building something? And how do they make money? And then lastly, do they tell other developers, right? I mean, if you look at some of the most successful API programs out there, folks like Twilio, those last couple of steps, they did an awesome job of making sure that developers returned and had a happy experience and that they told their friends, right? I mean, it was a huge part of that strategy. And then back to the topic of this conversation, what do I measure, right? What am I measuring at each step of this process? There's a developer portal site, right? So again, classic sort of Google Analytics type measures, right? Second thing is, Well, then I have to get developers registered, right? That's once they're on my site, have they signed up, right? Have they got an API key? How many of those are active? Call volume by day, revenue for, so as we go farther down there, you get dollars per app, right? They start measuring revenue. And then towards the end, you get referrals and net promoter score and those sort of things. So that's the funnel. So that's that's the second secret. The third secret is measuring your ecosystem. So now let's say you have people who are actually building on your API and building on your platform. Now what do I measure? Well, I think most, sort of the classic API ecosystem looks a bit like this. You have your APIs, you have developers build apps, and then you have users who use your apps, right? So I think, there's variations of this, but I think this is sort of the quintessential model. And every single step of the way, you should be thinking about what should I be measuring? What is important to me for my API to measure at every single one of these steps? So app users, right? So you got users, revenue per user, user growth rate, and lastly churn, because churn matters. The next one to think about is, okay, I have apps, right? So how many apps do I have built on my platform? That's a core metric for a lot of API programs. How much revenue? We talked about it before, but what channel is that? Are these building all mobile apps? Is that what I want? Are these web apps? Are they point-of-sale apps? What is the thing that people are building? Next is developers, right? What are the total number of developers that I have? And people love to sort of whip out this number and say, we have X number of developers on our platform, which, again, is not necessarily as bad as just total API calls, but it doesn't mean nearly as much as the second one, which is active developers, right? Because sometimes that number is 10% of your total developers, if you're lucky, right? So these things matter a lot. Revenue, top. That last one I threw out here was stuck developers. So this is also thinking about that analogy to the web world, where do people drop off my funnel, right? Did they get an API key and then actually never do anything with it? I should know that, right? If I'm writing an API program, I better well know where things are getting broken down in my funnel. My APIs, total API calls, total top API calls, and internal usage. Last one, I'll talk about that again in a second. And then lastly, we're going sort of back to the why question. And the why question is about revenue, partnerships, and those sorts of, answering the question strategically, why does this matter to me? The fourth one here is most APIs obey this, the power law, right? So the power law looks like this for APIs. Total API call volume on the y-axis, and then number of developers or apps on the x-axis, right? Looks a bit like the long tail. And the reality is, for most API programs, you care about the head, right? You really care about the head and the shoulder as to the bulk of the traffic, where is it coming from? And to me, that's really about the quality, not necessarily the quantity. And thinking about who they are, how am I going to know who they are, what am I measuring, those, and how do I cater to them, right? How do I make that even a bigger number, right? So I think this is a core thing to think about as a KPI secret as to what is my, how am I measuring that ecosystem, and then how am I looking at it from a power law perspective. I got two more secrets here before we talk about other things, but one is buy-in, right? So if you're going to set up KPIs, well, you better think about they don't exist in a vacuum, right? So I don't recommend that API teams and product owners necessarily define their own KPIs. Your KPIs really need to be done in conjunction with stakeholders, sponsors, right? And then within that, get some consensus about what are we measuring. When I come back to you 6 months from, as the API product owner, and I come back to you 6 months from now, I better have some sense as to how well I'm doing, and that was what people expected me to do, right? Was it revenue? Was it just traffic? Was it brand awareness? But to get that buy-in on those top 3 to 5 is super important, because at least you kind of know, am I going strategically on the right track, and how am I doing, or where do I need to adjust, right? It's the whole point of having the metrics. And the last secret I want to talk about is this idea of internal usage. And a lot of what I just talked about there was sort of external usage. But I think this actually may be as important as any of the rest of them. So I'll give you some examples as to why that is. So here's the Guardian. So the Guardian has a very successful API program. And as it turns out, this is what their pie chart, as they bifurcate and look at external versus internal API usage, it looks like this. It's about 70-30, right? It doesn't mean the external thing is not successful. It's just they use it a lot themselves. If that wasn't enough, think about Evernote, right? I think a lot of folks here have Evernote in their pocket on their app, on their device. And that little tiny sliver of, pie slice there, they actually have a good external API program. But the reality is that the app and the website use the API too, and they do such a huge volume of traffic on those that it just dwarfs everything else. So 99%. And if that wasn't enough, if you look at what Netflix does, Netflix is up to 99.9 some odd % of their traffic doesn't come from third-party developers. Doesn't come from somebody else. It's their own traffic. And if we go back to those two questions that I raised at the beginning, which is why and who, for them, and they used to have a public API program, which they've now shut off, because what they realized was that pie chart told them everything they needed to know, right? The why for them is they need to enable the Netflix experience on 1,000+ devices, and so that works. And for most of them, they and or their partners build those apps. So that's the who. It's not for every developer out there on the planet, and so they've optimized for that, and they measure that, and that's the KPI that matters to them. So I want to sort of do two things now, just towards the end here. I want to talk about a couple of warnings, and then I'll give you some other real-world examples. So warnings is this idea, what I would refer to as a vanity metric. This is, again, a slide that I used years ago that people sort of resonated with, which was like, here are companies that are making billions of API calls a day, right? This demonstrates how strategically important the APIs are to these companies, right? And the data, as you can see from the dates here, are a bit out of date, so who knows how much bigger those numbers are today, right? But they're doing billions of API calls a day. If you look at Netflix, now, as of 2014, they're up to 5 billion API calls a day, right? Huge volumes. Every single movie, every single interaction that occurs with Netflix on any device goes through their API, all of it. But Daniel Jacobson, who runs that program for Netflix, has said, what if, all things being equal, at the time of doing 30 billion, instead of doing 30 billion API calls, what if we could do that with 5? Right? So if you think about why that is, it's not that they want to be less successful. To them, the number of API calls isn't the measure. Netflix doesn't make money on API calls. Netflix makes money from subscriptions on their devices, right? So what if you could do everything else and just do it with a more efficient API call, right? So that's the kind of thing that they're looking at, because for them, the KPI isn't total number of API calls, right? It's movies delivered or something else, right? That's what they care about. The second warning I'll throw out there is just other sort of KPI traps that API providers fall into. And I think the top 3 that I would throw out there are not having a metrics process, right? All the stuff that we just talked about, they might have a few metrics, but they actually don't have a process by which they're either set up, monitored, managed, changed, some cycle in which there's actually a process and a feedback loop and a measurement loop where they're paying attention to that, right? They're not just taking it off the dashboard and going, oh, okay, this is what it is, right? There's actually a real meaningful process. The second one there is the wrong metrics, right? So it could be, hey, we don't know perfectly, particularly when you're doing something new like an API program, what my metrics should be per se. We make a good stab at it. But you shouldn't be afraid to go back and say, I'm going to adjust what I measure, right? These are the metrics that actually turn out are more important to me, right? So not being afraid to make those changes. And then I love this last one because I can't tell the number of times I've seen this, which is, sure, boss, we're going to have, particularly for public API programs, X number of developers set up on our API program by the end of the year, right? And almost every single time that's a trap, because it's always hard. This is all harder to do than it seems from the outside, right? So it's super hard, and so you have to be careful about the expectation management, particularly as a product owner of an API program, as to how that executive team, if I'm going back to the CEO, and I had said 6 months ago, at the beginning of the year, that I'm going to do X, and halfway through I'm like, oh shit, that's not actually working for me. You'd be careful about sort of managing those expectations and keeping people in the loop. So, and I realized there was one metric that I hadn't sort of put in here, and I think it's this one here. And a lot of you may have not ever sort of heard this acronym, semi made up, but what's your time to first hello world? And that is when a developer, when somebody, whether it's an internal developer, a partner, Joe developer, arrives on your developer portal, how long does it take them to get something working, right? Understand what you do, go through that process, get some code, and have something talking to your platform and working, right? That's that measure. And that's, to me, a lot of folks call that developer experience, right? That's, the website, you have user experience. In this world, you have developer experience, right? Another sort of parallel between the old world and the new world. And it's so important that it can make or break your API. If you look at the best API programs, they so often do a great job. And this is that second level of the developer funnel, right? Do they have a happy first-time experience? But it's just, you go, John, that's too subjective to measure. No, I can't do it. But I think don't forget about qualitative KPIs, right? User testing, surveys, forums, social media, all those are reasonable ways to think about measuring that. And so to wrap up, I just want to give you a couple of sample real-world KPIs, just kind of ones you might not have thought about before to give you a sense of what other people measure. So here's Evernote, speaking of them. One of the things they care about and they get measured on when they go back to the board is conversions. So that API, here's a quote from Evernote which says, we are seeing a trend where a person who uses another app with Evernote, API connected, are 50% more likely to convert to a paid, right? So that glue really matters. They also measure engagement, which is similar but different. So here they're talking about the relationship between them and the Pocket app, if you ever use that sort of offline reader. But it talks about how normally there's 15% engagement, where if you're using Evernote plus Pocket, it's 80% engagement, right? So there's an engagement record. Conversions, engagements, those both matter to Evernote. Here's Just Giving, right? Charity. They can measure revenue, and their API now, this chart is their developer community growth over time. But they now are on record saying that they now have 20 to 25% of their revenue is derived, is API driven, because that API is embedding them on other sites, and that leads to more donations. Here's Aviary, the photo editing service. And this is a chart that you don't see all the details on. It's simply showing that there were 3 billion edits across their partner network, right? So for them, the partner, of course, is a API-driven glue. And so what they're measuring is photo edits, right? So in some ways, it's, it's a combination of partners and these other things, but photo edits is a meaningful metric to them. And they, as of last year, had 3,500 apps, which is a pretty high number for a lot of API programs, right? So it's another, they're measuring multiple KPIs. And I got two more. One is NPR. So here's a content API. So there's a bunch of content APIs. There's New York Times. For them, the goal was, going back to the why, more eyeballs on their content. They're going to use the API to make that happen. So they measure API calls. And I just want to sort of call out one thing here, which is response volume and impressions. So for them, you make an API call, and you get back stories. And different API calls will return different volume of stories. So that's actually, they don't map one-to-one calls to number of stories, so that matters to them. And then they actually used to have an embedded beacon. So when this showed up on other contents, they would actually be able to measure ultimate impressions as it went through that ecosystem food chain. And last but not least, alcohol. It's more important later in the day. But vodka, Absolute Vodka, has an API program. And their team said, look, we sell vodka, but people buy drinks. So their goal was to figure out, okay, how are we going to ensure that we can distribute recipes and make sure that there's a good experience out there when people consume our stuff. So that was their KPI, right? I don't think a lot of folks here necessarily have a recipe goal, right? It's also about brand awareness and so on. And I think it just calls out this fundamental benefit of APIs, which is that, they let you go where your customer are, right? So here's a good example of that. So looping back, I think I give you some examples of how you might fill in those question marks, right? We talked about the fact that we're really early on in measuring this era and what do we do with our APIs. but I showed you, I think, a fair amount of the breadth of what you could look at. And I think the most important things are the who and the why, right? Why are you doing it? You need to have this lens, how are you going to look at it, right? And you need to have prioritization and then repeat. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I actually liked a lot of things you said. I spent a lot of time talking to people about mobile apps, and I think this concept of who the user is and how do you drive engagement is sort of pervasive in any product. And if you're looking at APIs as a product as well, that's something that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned this concept of you, your partners, and sort of everyone else, and there were different KPIs that were associated with that. Is there a different API strategy associated with that as well?
Yeah, well, I think it then maps to your business model strategy, I think, in a way, right? And I think, how are you going to target that, right? So am I trying to reach, because maybe I don't care about the long-tail developer, right? So if it's only partners, I'm only going to measure to that level, right? So it's a different strategy at that point, right? Do I want to have the longest one or less?
So the other thing that you talked about was this concept of lenses, and you had 8 different lenses. And you know, some of those could be CFO, CMO. Are those in conflict, or are those actually together when you're looking at the lenses?
There was a footnote, it's a good question, because actually I had a longer version of the getting buy-in slide, which was beware of conflicting agendas and priorities amongst your stakeholders, right? Because each of those stakeholders may have very different metrics that they're accountable for and they care about, right? So,
right, and that's I think a key challenge, and then driving those back to what the business goals are usually who gets their lens done first, right?
Exactly.
So,
me.
well,
All
thank
right,
you
great.
so much.
All right, thanks.
Wonderful having you, John.